When Father Massimo Albrizzi walked into the Sistine Chapel that morning, he didn't carry a Bible. He carried a manila folder, thick, fraying at the edges, sealed in red twine, and marked with a single word, confidential. He moved like a man rehearsed, each step measured, each glance calculated. He didn't look up at the frescoed ceilings or the cameras trained on his face from 5 different angles. He had one target, and that target sat directly across from him, Pope Leo XIV. The room had been arranged like a dialogue, but everyone knew this was a duel. Pews removed, cables taped down. A circular table stood beneath Michelangelo's Last Judgment, as if the saints themselves were leaning in to listen. Between the Pope and the priest lay 2 glasses of water, untouched, and 2 microphones that hummed like nerves about to snap. This wasn't just any broadcast. It was the first time in modern history that a sitting pope had agreed to an unfiltered, unscripted conversation with one of his own inner circle on live television. But Father Massimo hadn't come to converse. He had come to confront. He believed he was about to expose the most dangerous man in Christendom. In his eyes, Pope Leo XIV was not a reformer. He was a firebrand cloaked in humility, dismantling sacred tradition in the name of mercy. He called it transparency. Father Massimo called it betrayal. He had spent the last 3 years collecting what he called evidence, private letters, leaked transcripts, disputed theological annotations, all of it designed to trap the Pope with his own words. He didn't smile as he opened the folder. He smirked. "Your Holiness," he began, "many are concerned about your recent decisions. But more than that, they're confused by what you seem unwilling to say." He slid a page forward, a quote, underlined in red, a doctrinal contradiction, or so he thought. For a moment, the chapel was silent, deeper than silence. The kind of stillness that arrives not when sound is absent, but when truth is approaching. The Pope didn't touch the paper. He didn't blink. Instead, he leaned slightly forward, not to threaten, not to retreat, but to allow the weight of what he was about to say to settle across the room like incense before the altar. And when he finally spoke, his voice was not defensive. It was clean, slow, measured, and devastating. Many have built their faith on the idea that God needs no defending. But the truth is, it is not God we defend when we silence the truth. It is ourselves. The folder, the research, the accusations, they all sat untouched. Because with those words, the Pope didn't just answer the question. He exposed the game. And in that moment, everyone knew. This wasn't an interview. This was the dismantling of a centuries-old masquerade. Not with rage, not with rebellion, but with something far more dangerous, clarity. So before we go further, before the weight of what was said next threatens your comfort or awakens your conscience, pause and ask yourself, where are you watching this from? Not just your city or country, but your spirit. Because what unfolds next will not leave you neutral, and silence will no longer protect you. He had not sought the chair of Peter. That is what made him dangerous. Pope Leo XIV, born Tomas de Alvear, did not rise through Vatican corridors slick with compromise and ambition. He rose through mud, blood, and fire, fields where cardinals never walked and cameras never reached. In the refugee camps of Aleppo, he was the man who stayed behind when UN forces pulled out. In the favelas of Sao Paulo, he was the priest who celebrated Mass under torn tarps beside shivering mothers. In the poisoned jungles of Ecuador, he baptized infants in rivers dark with oil and ash, weeping not just for their souls, but for the silence of the world. He spoke 7 languages, but it was the language of suffering that made him impossible to ignore. By the time the conclave chose him, it was not because he was liked, but because he was needed. And the moment he accepted the white zaquetto, he began doing what few had dared in centuries, telling the truth plainly. He refused palatial retreats. He dismissed personal drivers. He opened the Vatican's sealed archives. And then he started naming names. But not everyone saw this as courage. Across from him, poised like a blade sheathed in velvet, sat Father Massimo Albrizzi. Born into Florentine nobility, he had never known war, but he had memorized every line of canon law by age 20. His intellect was undeniable, his charm disarming, his loyalty to Vatican protocol unbreakable. He rose fast, too fast. Some whispered of quiet deals, private dinners, and letters passed between closed doors. But none could ever prove it. He smiled like a man who had never lost a debate. But he had never faced a man who refused to play by those rules. He believed the church was held together by secrecy, and Pope Leo believed it was dying from it. The two were not just opponents. They were symbols of two very different futures. One gilded in tradition, cloaked in silence. The other pierced by light, raw, flawed, exposed, but real. And now, for the first time, they had been placed in the same room. Not behind closed doors, not in whispered councils, but beneath the eyes of the world. The event was called The Future of the Church, Transparency and Truth. Broadcast live to 83 countries. Translated in real time. The Sistine Chapel had been wired for video, microphones hidden among centuries-old tapestries. The altar removed, replaced by a circle of chairs. There would be no pulpit to hide behind, no confessionals to retreat into. Only questions, and answers, and silence thick enough to be carved with a knife. And the world was not watching out of reverence. They were watching because they smelled collapse. The church stood at a threshold, scarred by decades of abused cover-ups, fractured by ideological war, hemorrhaging members, and drifting from the soul it once claimed to protect. And then came Leo, a pope with a broom in one hand and a torch in the other. He had stripped down rituals. He had revised catechisms. He had declared that God does not hide behind Latin or lace. And now, he had agreed to answer for it. Live. Why did it matter? Because this wasn't just a conversation between two priests. It was the spiritual equivalent of a Civil War summit. Two roads, two visions. Only one could remain. And Father Albrizzi, well-prepared, meticulously briefed, seated like a man who knew the outcome before the debate began, was convinced the world would side with him. What he hadn't accounted for was the one thing Pope Leo XIV never spoke loudly about. His authority did not come from politics. It came from the wounds he had kissed, the ones he addressed, the ones no camera had ever seen. That authority didn't shout. It whispered. But when it whispered, the world leaned in. So before the first question had even landed, the sides were already chosen. One stood for power through preservation. The other for faith through fire. And if you believe truth should never be buried under bureaucracy, if you believe that God is not honored by shadows, but by light, subscribe to Holy Shadows. But if you're still hesitating, if some part of you still clings to comfort instead of clarity, go to the comments and tell us why. Not to defend yourself, but so that at least once you speak out loud what you've been afraid to admit. Because silence is no longer neutral. And this story has only just begun. There was no bell to signal the beginning. Only the subtle hiss of air shifting in the ducts above and the red light blinking on the camera that faced Father Albrizzi's side of the table. He began with a smile. Not warm, not hostile, but the kind of practiced expression that could be rehearsed in a mirror and sharpened in the presence of men who dealt in influence. He folded his hands before him, the dossier of papers now closed and used for the moment, like a dagger set aside to charm before cutting. Your Holiness, he said smoothly, transparency is a noble idea. One that, I think, even your critics would agree is well-intentioned. But I wonder, are you not afraid of misinterpretation? Of seeing your words twisted by those who neither love the church nor understand her? The tone was respectful. The trap was obvious. The camera panned gently toward Pope Leo, who did not lean forward or bristle at the implication. Instead, he blinked once, slowly, like a man processing not the words, but the spirit beneath them. He folded his hands as well, mirroring the priest. But his fingers were not tense. They rested as one might hold a candle too sacred to crush. Truth misunderstood, he said calmly, is still better than lies well spoken. There was a pause, longer than expected. The air grew heavy, not with confrontation, but with consideration. Somewhere in the back row, a journalist stopped typing. Albrizi's smile faltered only slightly. He nodded as if conceding a minor point, then pressed. Then allow me to ask plainly, Your Holiness. Some are saying your recent reforms regarding the liturgy, the annulment process, even your statements on non-believers, are not just bold. They say they border on heresy. The word landed with the precision of a blade. Sharp, surgical, and utterly public. He knew what he was doing. He had chosen the word carefully, not to accuse directly, but to echo the whispers already circling Vatican corridors like smoke without fire. And if Pope Leo so much as blinked, the headlines would write themselves by morning. But the Pope did not blink. He smiled. It was not the smile of a man cornered, nor of a man superior. It was the smile of someone who had lived long enough to see fear dressed as faith and had learned to pity it. Christ didn't die to preserve comfort, he said softly. He died to awaken courage. There it was, not a rebuttal, not a denial, a reminder, and it pierced through the question like sunlight through stained glass. Albrizi sat still, but his jaw stiffened. The moment had not gone the way he intended. The viewers, watching from across time zones and continents, didn't see a pope on the defense. They saw a shepherd refusing to kneel before a theology of fear. Somewhere in the control room, a producer marked the timestamp. This moment would go viral. But inside the chapel, the tension took on a new shape. It was no longer the anticipation of conflict. It was the dawning realization that what was unfolding was not a debate. It was a dismantling. Quiet, steady, certain. Pope Leo hadn't come to prove anything. He had come to reveal. Each of his answers deflected the power dynamic. He didn't argue on Albrizi's terms. He redefined the terms entirely. He didn't play chess. He changed the board. And for the first time, Albrizi's hands tightened just slightly over the folder that still lay unopened. Because he knew. He knew he was facing a man who couldn't be baited. A man who had seen too much pain to be rattled by rhetorical games. The audience felt it too. This was no longer about theology or tradition. It was about fear and the man who had stopped fearing. If you feel the world needs more of this kind of courage, more leaders who do not speak to win, but to heal, subscribe to Holy Shadows now. And if you're still unsure, if some voice inside you still says wait or what if, then write it below. Tell us what holds you back. But don't vanish into silence, because silence is where the old lies grow back. And this is the hour of reckoning. Albrizi's fingers moved at last. He opened the folder, slowly, deliberately, not in haste, but with the cold confidence of a man who believed he still held the blade that would end the conversation. Inside were not secrets, at least not in the traditional sense, but documents. Pages bearing papal decrees, most of them signed by Pope Leo himself, others annulled by him in his first year. He selected one, lifted it without looking down. Read aloud. Motu proprio, dated March 12th, year 1. You abolished the Pontifical Commission on Ecclesiastical Culture. That body existed for over a century. Why dismantle it? The Pope didn't respond. Albrizi continued. July 9th. You rewrote Canon 1389 to reduce the penalty for clergy who defy episcopal jurisdiction. Are we now rewarding disobedience? Still, Pope Leo was silent, but his eyes had shifted. Gone was the gentleness that carried his earlier replies. What rose now behind his gaze was not anger. No, it was memory. Albrizi leaned forward, emboldened. Your Holiness, he said, the titles now spoken like veiled challenge. You claim to walk in the tradition of Peter. But what tradition is this? One that dismantles discipline? That makes every local parish its own kingdom? You are not decentralizing. You are dividing. You're replacing clarity with confusion. What you call reform, many call populist spiritualism. The words echo, not loud but long. Populist, spiritualism, a clever phrase, an accusation draped in sophistication. And it was then, only then, that the Pope responded. He looked not at Albrizi, but at the far wall, where the image of Christ loomed above the altar, arms raised, wounds visible. When he spoke, his voice was lower than before, less precise, less rhetorical, more like confession. I remember the boy's name. he said quietly. Yusuf. The room froze. He was 6 when I found him, covered in debris, half his face burned from the strike that hit the Aleppo corridor. His sister's body was still warm beside him. He asked me if she was asleep. Albritsi said nothing. The audience, on camera and in the chapel, did not blink. I carried him through 47 checkpoints. He died before we reached the border. Now he turned to face Albritsi. You want to talk about power? But what power feeds a starving mother abandoned by the world? What power holds a dying child while the drones circle overhead? He gestured to the papers. You cite decrees. I cite blood. No one dare move. The moral thread emerged slowly from the silence, like incense rising without visible fire. His words now shaped not by argument, but experience. Power without love, he said, corrupts. He paused. But love without truth deceives. The balance struck deep. He had not denied the charge. He had transformed it. He had not defended his papacy. He had revealed its foundation. Albritsi inhaled, sharply, though he tried to hide it. His next move, whatever it was, would be interpreted not as inquiry, but as resistance to something holy. He had asked for an explanation and been given a witness. Around them, small movements began to ripple. A Vatican aide lowered his eyes. A correspondent from Lisbon uncrossed her legs and leaned forward. Someone whispered a prayer in Latin under their breath. The tension between questions had become a character of its own. It now hovered between them, thick, unspoken, consecrated. Pope Leo did not seek applause. He had not raised his voice, or struck the table, or accused his accuser. He had spoken of a dying boy in a forgotten alley. And in that boy, he had dismantled 100 years of bureaucracy. If this truth speaks to you, if you hear in his voice something your heart cannot ignore, then Holy Shadows is your home. Subscribe now. But if part of you would rather look away, if silence feels safer than standing, tell us why in the comments. Because the church has ignored enough voices. Don't let yours be one of them. Not this time. There are moments in history when a man loses control not because he is overwhelmed, but because he realizes, too late, that control is no longer possible. Father Massimo Albritsi reached that moment not with a scream, but with a tremor in his voice that cracked the mask he'd worn for decades. He was no longer the composed theologian, no longer the elegant defender of doctrine. He was a man watching his structure, the one he had served, polished and protected, begin to buckle under the quiet weight of a single life remembered and spoken aloud. And so he struck. You're tearing down centuries of order, he shouted. The room jolted, not with noise, but with disbelief. He had raised his voice at the Vicar of Christ, on air, on sacred ground. But he was not finished. His next words were not aimed at the Pope, but at every ear beyond those walls. Are you even a Pope anymore? Or just a puppet of globalists? A spokesman for sentimental faith, soft on doctrine, and obsessed with headlines. It was not a question. It was an accusation carved from fear, the fear that he no longer understood the church he once ruled by rules. Pope Leo did not flinch. He did not rise. He did not speak immediately. He leaned forward just slightly, enough for the cameras to catch the reflection in his eyes. They were not angry. They were clear, like fire held in glass. And when he spoke, his voice didn't match the volume thrown at him. It cut beneath it. I've held the hand of a dying child in Myanmar, he said, while men in Rome debated liturgy. He said no more, because he didn't need to. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was sacred. No sound but the hum of the live stream monitors. No reaction from the Pope's aides, nor from Albritsi's handlers seated in the rear pews. The reporters stopped typing. The producer's earpiece buzzed, but even he forgot to breathe. There are words that break arguments, and then there are words that break people. Albritsi didn't speak. He couldn't, and Leo wasn't finished. His voice returned, not louder, but lower, as if inviting every viewer, every priest, every mother in hiding, every believer burned by betrayal, to come closer. You call it naive, he said, to protect the innocent. A pause, a breath. I call it sacred. Those words did not shake the room. They silenced it. Because in that sentence, everything the church had buried beneath bureaucracy, shame, and pride came roaring to the surface. And not with violence, but with authority. Not from papal robes or canonical citations, but from a man who had walked into war zones while others clung to marble. Albrizzi had launched a missile. Leo had answered with a tombstone. The confrontation reached its climax, not in flames, but in a stillness that judged everyone present. Not just Albrizzi, every viewer, every bishop watching, every heart pretending neutrality. If that line moved you, if something inside you cracked open as those words rang out, then it means you were part of something bigger than fear or tradition or politics. You were part of a church trying to remember its soul. Join Holy Shadows. Subscribe now. But if it didn't move you, if your heart stayed stone, or if you still think this is just theater, go to the comments and tell us why. Not because we want your anger, but because your silence is no longer an option. Pope Leo did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. What followed was not a rebuttal. It was a dismantling, not with heat, but with light. The kind that doesn't burn, but reveals. He leaned back, his hands folded in front of him, not in retreat, but in measured authority. His tone bore no triumph, just sorrow refined by clarity. You confuse engagement, he said slowly, with endorsement. The words fell with precision, like a scalpel, not a sword. Listening doesn't mean compromise. It means love. No one moved. He wasn't defending himself. He was exposing something older than both of them. A sickness cloaked in clerical robes. A fear disguised as orthodoxy. And then came the mirror. He turned, not with aggression, but with grief. His gaze never left Albrizzi's face. Why does defending the voiceless disturb you, Father? His voice remained soft, yet it carried the full weight of heaven's judgment. What makes you uncomfortable about exposing sin? Unless it's your own shadow you fear. The line hung in the air like incense before the altar. Heavy, unavoidable, uncontainable. And Albrizzi, the man who had quoted counsels, rattled off cannons, smiled through fire, froze. His lips parted, but no answer came. He blinked, then looked away, first to the frescoed ceiling, then to the floor. For the first time, the challenger broke eye contact. The entire studio seemed to inhale, then hold its breath. From the back, someone whispered an amen. Another, barely audible, said, "Finally." One of the younger journalists lowered her pen, her eyes shining, not with opinion, but recognition. This wasn't strategy. It was truth laid bare. Not the kind drafted in synods or debated in seminaries, but the kind that levels pride, the kind that speaks directly to the soul. And as silence returned, a silence now reverent, not tense. It was no longer just Albrizzi who stood judged. It was every priest who hid behind Latin, every bishop who signed papers in silence while victims wept, every believer who knew but stayed quiet. Leo had not destroyed his opponent. He had revealed him, and in doing so, he revealed us. If this moment opened your eyes, if you felt something shift inside you, something too long ignored, hit that subscribe button now. Let truth anchor your faith, not fear. But if it didn't, if this still feels like discomfort and not deliverance, go to the comments and explain why protecting truth makes you hesitate. Because in the end, it's not the church's silence that damns us. It's our own. Pope Leo let the silence linger, not to punish, but to allow space for reflection. Then, with the gentleness of a shepherd walking among the wounded, he spoke again. His voice had changed. The fire was still there, but now it flickered low, warm, pastoral. This was never about argument, he said, almost to the room itself, as if speaking beyond the cameras, beyond Albrizzi, beyond even the marble walls of the Sistine Chapel. It's about who we are becoming. He let the words settle, not rushed, not forced, just true. The church was never meant to be a fortress of pride, nor a courtroom for the righteous. It was meant to be a field hospital, a place where the broken are not accused, but embraced. He looked directly into the lens, the audience behind the glass, the faithful, the angry, the doubting, the watching. This isn't about church politics. It's about your neighbor, He gestured gently, as if calling someone back from the edge. Your family. Then, with a quiet conviction that pierced deeper than any doctrine. Your soul. No applause followed. None was needed, because he wasn't performing. He was inviting. And now the message widened. We can disagree on method, he said. We can wrestle with structure, liturgy, tradition. He smiled faintly. Even apostles argued. But we can never disagree on the mission. His tone grew firmer. Not louder, just more anchored. To love. To defend. To bring light into a world that has gotten too comfortable with its shadows. The camera panned gently. Across faces softened. Across shoulders once stiff, now slightly bowed. And then it returned to him. Still seated. Still steady. Still Pope. He offered no threats. No ultimatums. Just a final charge, like the final word in a dying man's will. What world will we leave behind if we stay silent when the truth cries out? The line didn't need music. It didn't need editing. It needed only to be heard. So now, if you want that world to be better, if you want to stand with light, not just admire it, subscribe to Holy Shadows. Let your voice count. But if you're still watching and haven't, ask yourself in the comments, what are you waiting for? Because the truth isn't knocking anymore. It's already in the room. And silence is no longer an option. What would you have said if you were in that room? Would you have found the courage to stand with truth, even as centuries of tradition pressed down upon you? Or would you have hidden behind familiar words, afraid to shatter the fragile peace with questions no one dared ask? This is the moment to decide, not just for Pope Leo or Father Albrizzi, but for yourself. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Speak freely, but speak with respect. Because here, we are not just debating doctrine, we are building something sacred. A space where questions are welcomed, where doubts are met with grace, and where the search for truth is never finished. As we close, let this blessing rest on your heart. May we all seek truth with humble hearts. May we carry it gently, fiercely, and without fear. And may no shadow, no matter how holy it pretends to be, hide the light we were born to carry. This is Holy Shadows. Subscribe now, or step into the comments and let us hear you wrestle. But whatever you do, don't stay in the dark.